All right, it's the final game of the match, Magnus Carlsen versus Hans Niemann. This is the game where Magnus Carlsen plays a brand new opening. It's shocking, and this is my favorite game of the match. The entire game is insane, all the way up until the very end. Here, Magnus opens A3. Of course, this has been played before. So far, so good. Hans goes E5, striking in the center. Now, knight to C3 from Magnus Carlsen. Now, Magnus does play this idea a lot. His idea, black goes D5, maybe D4 later. Magnus is actually going to go knight to A2. I've seen Magnus play this so many times, so trust me when I say that is the basic idea. Here, Hans does not go for that. He doesn't go for the move D5. Instead, knight to F6 on the board. Hans Niemann, I'm sure he studied Magnus Carlsen's games. He doesn't want to play that D5, D4, that knight A2 idea from Magnus. He's too good at that. Now here, Magnus, F4, breaking on the king side. Already getting very strange. Here, Hans Niemann can just take the pawn. It is a free pawn. That is the best move. But Hans Niemann doesn't do that. He tries to stay nice and solid. He goes E4, expanding in the center. Again, not playing into Magnus Carlsen's games. And here a couple different moves have been played, but no one has ever played the strongest idea. Magnus Carlsen here goes D3, and on move 4, we have a brand new game that has never been played before in the history of chess. This is a novelty, and this is Magnus Carlsen's new opening on move 4, trying to go F4 and then breaking in the center with the move D3. All right, let's see how it plays out from here. Black takes on D3, and now technically the computer says you can go for a crazy pawn sacrifice starting with E4, and then if D takes C2, queen takes C2. However, instead, Magnus C takes D3 is the move. Hans goes D5. Magnus goes E4, striking in the center. Now Hans has the option of going D4. That would complicate the game massively. Magnus would likely go knight to E2, then knight F3, trying to gang up on the pawn. Black goes C5. Now, instead of that, here Hans again stays nice and solid. He takes on E4, white takes back, then the queens come off the board, and then knight to C6. Now, don't worry, this endgame is the most exciting endgame you will see all year. Trust me when I say that. This game was played in bullet time control, so literally 1 second per move. Here we go, Magnus, knight to F3, Hans, bishop C5, solid idea, potentially wanting to go knight D4 in the future. Now here, of course, if Magnus goes king to C2, then knight D4 is going to be an idea. Instead, Magnus plays sort of a waiting move, H3. The idea is Hans Niemann could threaten knight G4 and then knight to F2 check, forking the king and the rook at some point. So H3 does block that idea permanently, so very solid idea. Now here, Hans, bishop E6, setting up long castles with the check on the king with the rook on the D8 square, so very solid. Magnus gets out of the way of that, king C2, then long castles, then Magnus F5, putting pressure on that bishop, forcing it to go back. Now here, Hans Niemann, his best move is potentially just bishop D7, retreating bishop. But he doesn't do that. This is a bullet game, of course. Instead, he jumps in with the knight. Knight takes E4. Now, this move does have an idea. Here, of course, if Magnus takes the knight on E4, then Hans Niemann goes bishop takes F5 with the pin on the knight, and then black is going to win back the piece and have those two pawns. That would be a massive advantage. Instead, here Magnus finds the best move. It is definitely not knight takes E4. Instead, it's the intermediate move, F takes E6. What's the idea here? Well, it's simple. If black takes on the C3 square with the knight, white's going to recapture with the B pawn, and he's going to have a perfectly fine game with a very nice advantage. Instead, here Hans tries to complicate things right away. Knight G3, forking both the bishop and the rook on the H1 square. The rook looks like it has to go somewhere, maybe H2, but instead, Magnus E takes F7, giving up the rook on the H1 square. Knight takes H1 from Hans, and this game is getting insanely complicated. Here, Hans Niemann is up a rook. Magnus has the extra minor piece. However, that pawn on the F7 square is incredibly dangerous, and that gives Magnus the advantage. Now here, Magnus, bishop C4, a good move. The threat now, of course, is bishop G5 with the double attack on the rook on the D8 square, and the rook on A1 hits the knight on the H1 square. If Magnus Carlsen gets that in, he would be simply winning here. Now, Hans Niemann, knight G3, excellent move, getting the knight out of the attack preemptively. That is literally the only idea you could do. Now, Magnus, bishop F4, keeping up the pressure, hitting the knight on the G3 square. Knight to H5, Hans hits the bishop back. Bishop G5, pressuring the rook on D8, then knight to F6, blocking the attack. Now, Magnus, rook E1, activating the rook, potentially setting up rook to e8 ideas in the future. Of course, not viable right now, but excellent idea. Now Hans, rook f8, blocking the pawn on the f7 square. There are no f8 ideas immediately. Now here Magnus, he increases the pressure right away. Knight to e4, pressuring the knight on the f6 square, setting up knight takes or bishop takes ideas. Now Hans, he defends, bishop e7, and here we have a critical position. Here, the best idea for Magnus, this is almost impossible to find in a bullet game, is first you go bishop e6, driving back the king to the b8 square, then you retreat the knight back to g3, setting up knight to f5 ideas. And if that knight gets over here to the f5 square, that would be incredibly strong, pressuring the bishop, pressuring the g7 pawn. Now, of course, this is a bullet game. Magnus goes for the simpler option. Knight takes f6, Hans takes back with the bishop. Then Magnus takes on f6 again with the bishop, Hans takes back. And here, again, we have that position where Hans Niemann is up the exchange. He has the rook for the extra bishop of Magnus Carlsen, but that pawn on the f7 square is so strong that it does mean Magnus Carlsen still has roughly level chances in this game. Now here, Magnus Carlsen has a whole bunch of decent ideas. For example, king c3, almost anything else is playable. Instead, Magnus Carlsen blunders. He goes rook to e6. What's the problem with this move? Well, it looks logical. You are pressuring the f6 pawn. If you get rook takes f6 in the game, you're going to be doing great. However, Hans Niemann, in a bullet game, finds the key move instantly, knight to a5, putting pressure on that bishop on the c4 square. Now, here's the problem. If that bishop goes back to, say, d3 or e2, then the move rook takes f7 is possible. Hans Niemann wins the pawn. Then he's going to be up the exchange and a pawn, and he just wins. Instead, bishop a2, Magnus has to keep this bishop on this diagonal. Now the threat, of course, is if rook takes f7, perhaps there's going to be something else with a discovered attack once the rook moves. However, rook takes f7 anyway, and currently there are no good discovered attacks. All right, Magnus, b4, pressuring the knight. He's trying to force knight to c6, and then you take on c6 with the rook with a discovered attack on the rook on the f7 square. For example, if Hans Niemann blunders and goes knight to c6, then rook takes, b takes, bishop takes f7, and here Magnus has those two minor pieces versus the rook of Hans Niemann. That would be enough to win the game. However, Hans Niemann, he doesn't fall for that trap. He finds the best move, rook g7. This move is so incredibly strong. Here, if Magnus Carlsen takes the knight on the a5 square, then rook takes g2 hits with check, and suddenly Hans Niemann's rooks are flying into the game, and he's doing excellent. Now here, Magnus, g4, stops the rook takes g2 idea. Very good. Now knight c6, and now here is the difference. Rook takes c6 is not possible because the rook on the g7 square is out of the attack of the bishop on the a2 square. That means, of course, rook takes b takes doesn't work. Bishop takes f7 isn't possible. And here, Magnus Carlsen, he's just down a massive amount of material. All right, Magnus picks up the pawn on the f6 square. Best idea. Rook e7 from Hans, getting the rook back to a better file here. Of course, the g file being blocked off by that pawn on the g4 square. And now Magnus finds the best idea. Bishop e6, blocking the rook and forcing king b8 ideas from Hans Niemann. Now, of course, here, Hans Niemann plays the key move, king to b8. He plays the key move, king to b8. Hans Niemann didn't play king b8. Instead, in this position, he played rook takes e6. He gives up the rook for the bishop for absolutely no reason. It's a bullet game. Crazy things happen. Now the game is level. Both sides have the four pawns, the rook and the knight. It is literally anyone's game. Magnus is going to try to push his pawn through on the king side here. Hans Niemann on the queen side. Let's see what happens. All right, rook f8, hitting the rook on the f3 square. Excellent move. If the knight moves anywhere, say knight g5, then knight d4 wins the game on the spot with the double attack on the king and the rook. So the knight cannot move. Here Magnus finds the only idea, b5. Of course, the idea is if you take the knight, then you win this knight. And if the knight moves, then this knight can move as there's no knight d4 threat anymore. Now Hans, he just takes the knight. Rook takes f3. Magnus takes back. Hans takes back on c6. And now we have a rook endgame where both sides have the pawn majority on opposite sides of the board. Again, this is going to be an all-out slugfest to promote a pawn. This is going to be really exciting. All right, Magnus, rook h6, threatening the pawn. He doesn't want to win the pawn on the c6 square. Instead, he wants to win h7 and then just start bulldozing this pawn down the board. Hans Niemann, rook takes a3, g5 for Magnus. He's obviously going to win the pawn on the h7 square. Rook g3 pressures g5, h4. Now Hans Niemann, a5, expanding on the queen side, and Magnus Carlsen finally wins the pawn on the h7 square. Now both sides have 2 to 3 pawns on opposite sides of the board. Again, this is just an all-out blitz, bullet, slugfest here. Hans Niemann getting his pawn going on the queen side. Magnus pressuring c6. Hans Niemann pushing his c-pawn. Now g6, a3, h5. Both sides going for it. c4 for Hans Niemann. Of course, the king is being cut off on the third rank by the rook. There's nothing Magnus Carlsen can do right now to stop the advance of those pawns. Magnus Carlsen, rook h8, hitting the king, then transfer the rook to the f8 square, potentially setting up ideas like rook f7, then g7, h6, h7, g8. He's got to keep pushing those pawns. Now Hans gives the king a check, driving it back to the back rank. Of course, if he went to, say, c3, then a2, and it's almost impossible to stop that pawn. So instead of that, king b1 played here in the game. Now c3. Hans Niemann setting up ideas based on perhaps c2 or a2, trying to deflect the king, then pushing forward with the other pawn down the board. Now Magnus, he makes a massive mistake. Rook to f1. What's the problem with this move? Well, Hans Niemann finds the only flaw. c2 check, hitting the king. Now, if the king goes to the c1 square, a2 virtually wins by force. For example, if the king goes to b2, then the winning combination, this is beautiful, c1 queen with a double attack on the king. That means you literally have to take the queen here, and then a1 queen is checkmate. Brilliant idea. So instead of king c1, here Magnus has to go king to a1, and then rook d2, the winning idea, setting up rook d1 threats. Now Magnus, he's not out yet. He has one last trick up his sleeve. g7, threatening to promote immediately if he gets that queen without getting checkmated. That queen could come flying back into the game, start giving checks to the king on the b7 square, and he's going to be just fine. Now, Hans Niemann, rook d1. Of course, if you take the rook, that is game over. As the queen promotes with check, it comes flying over, winning all the pawns. Nothing you could do. So, king a2 for Magnus. Now, c1 queen. Hans Niemann is literally one move away from delivering checkmate. Magnus, he takes the rook on the d1 square. Now, this is the big swindle. If Hans Niemann takes the rook on d1, then g8 queen, and here there is no checkmate, and Hans Niemann has nothing more than a draw. Of course, Magnus with that outside pass pawn here. Now, instead, Hans Niemann, move 45. He does not fall for it. He does not take the rook. Instead, queen to b2 delivers the checkmate. What an unbelievable game and a brand new opening idea by Magnus Carlsen. Both sides playing unbelievably well. And yes, this was a video about Magnus Carlsen destroying Hans Niemann. I hope the first 5 games satisfied you with that, but I just had to throw in this final game of Magnus Carlsen and his new opening. I hope you enjoyed it. All right, Chess YouTube, if you love this video, please show me some love. Like the video, subscribe, and comment down below what you liked, what you didn't like, what you want to see me cover in my next videos. And while you're at it, check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist. It's got all of his latest games, his openings. I think you're going to love it. And I will see you in the next video.